Welcome to MEM Tips and Tricks. We are looking into PowerShell App Deployment Toolkit. And Chris, all the way from Australia, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
That's very cool that you you just reached out to me and asked if I wanted a demo of some very cool stuff. And of course, I would like a demo of some cool stuff. So Chris, you and I, we know each other from the LinkedIn channel, which is provided by Angel, the Modern Endpoint group. And it's so cool to be peers with you in there.
Yeah, it's a great community.
Very great community. So, Chris, let's talk about VSCode and how to get started with that.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick demo today how I'm using VSCode for Devops, primarily for building Win32 app deployments within InTune. I've had some experience using PowerShell Application Deployment Toolkit, mainly with SCCM in the past, but finding that the tool itself is really good for InTune. It fills a lot of the gaps that InTune, it's not quite there yet if you were to compare it with SCCM. So I'm using VSCode and PowerShell Application Deployment Toolkit to create a template system, really just to streamline the build process. So to get started, I'll just fire up a browser. I'm going to hit up the toolkit. Hosted on GitHub at the moment, and what I like to do, and I won't do this every time because obviously I've got my own repository for this now, but for people that want to get started, not necessarily with this toolkit, any toolkit that you want to use, I find that it's a good idea to fork it. Take a copy of it, you have your own repository, and then you can start to create your own branches. Then you have the option just to pull in fixes, bug fixes, or features that the upstream repository is publishing. So pretty simple. You have to have a GitHub account, obviously, in this case. I'm going to hit fork up here now. I've already forked it, so it's giving me a message that I can't fork it again. If this is the first time you're doing it, all it's going to do is pull in a copy of this repository into your own personal GitHub, which I'm going to follow through here. Now I have my repository. I can then pull this down to my machine and start developing. Within GitHub, you can hit the code icon here, and it gives you some options for cloning. If you're not familiar with Git, I recommend jump online. There's some great articles out there on it. It's probably the best source control tool out there. Cloning is essentially bringing a copy of that code down to my workstation so I can start to play with it. So I'm going to get a copy of the URL here, and I'm going to fire up VSCode, which I've pre-installed. And what I'm going to do is bring up a terminal. This is an integrated terminal within VSCode. By default, it will use PowerShell. You can customize this yourself. You can use Git shell, you can use Bash, you can use Python, any shell that you can install on Windows. You can make that the primary shell within VSCode. The really cool thing about it is you can make the shell aware or project aware. So I'll go into it a little bit later, but essentially make the default shell for the project, for the code that you're using. So I'm going to just start down here and create a demo folder. Let's just say make directory demo, change into the demo directory, and I'm going to git clone. This is obviously the command line way of doing it. There is a graphical interface way of doing it, which I will show you in just a moment. You can see the blinding speed we have down here in Australia with our internet. All right, so we have our code on the machine now, and I'm going to just open this up and bring it into VS Code so I can start to play with it. Okay, just open the folder. Got my folder here. And anybody that's used PowerShell Application Deployment Toolkit before will be familiar with this structure, but a couple of things that you'll notice about it. What I've done here is I pulled in my fork of this repository, and my fork I've called, I have a branch in there called Devops, and this is where I've started to customize the repository itself. So you'll notice a couple of things. There's quite a lot of files missing here. If you were to look at the original PowerShell toolkit, okay, and they haven't been deleted. And what I've done is I've customized the project so that I can see just the code that I need to see. You know, if you're developing or building deployments, you don't really need to see everything. You don't need to see the license agreement or the PDF files or the test folder. I just want to see the primary PowerShell script and its components. It's just a way to cut things down. Something else you'll notice is down here, I've got a little prompt here to install some recommended extensions. So before this demo started, what I did was I uninstalled all the extensions out of VS Code so that I could show you with your projects, you can, in the settings, say what extensions you're using for the project. So if another developer was to come and open up that project, they'll get a little prompt. So in this case, it's just PowerShell. So I'm going to install PowerShell, and I have another one here called TODO Tree, which is a nice one, and I'll show you why. And it's just going away and installing these extensions so that I can start to use them with my project. And I'm pretty much ready to go now. So what I'll do now is I'll show you how I got to this point. Okay, so a really simple way to do that is we can just switch back to the master branch. And if you watch the file explorer here, you'll see it'll change and it'll show you all the files on the master branch. And this is probably what most people will be familiar with seeing that have used the toolkit before. You can see all the files associated with the project, all the default files, okay? So this is a starting point, right? Let's just say I've just forked this repository. I've just cloned it down to my computer. It's the vanilla version of the toolkit, but I want to start to customize it to make it work for me. All right, so the first thing I would generally do is I like to use keyboard shortcuts, but you can actually just use the menu commands up here. Really important part of Visual Studio Code is the command palette. This is probably the command you'll use most, right? So Control-Shift-P, you can start to type and bring up any command within Visual Studio Code, or just do searches. It uses fuzzy searching. So what I like to do with a project like this or any project is I want to cut down all the bits and pieces that I don't want to see. All right, so I'm just going to go into the menu settings here, and I'm going to say workspace. All right, you'll notice we've got user and workspace for settings. And this is the really cool thing about VS Code, right? I could set up global settings for myself, and it stores its settings in JSON files. You hover over here, you can see the path to it. But the nicer thing is you can set up settings for the workspace itself, and it'll actually follow the project around. So if we switch back to my Devops branch that I created, you'll notice this VS Code folder. So when you create a workspace setting, within the folder of the project you're working on, it'll create a VS Code folder. If I open this guy up, we can have a look inside him. This is where it starts to store all your settings for this project that VS Code will be aware of. This is the primary one, okay, settings. If we open this guy up, we can start to pick apart and have a look at how I've set up my project. So generally what I do, I start by hiding things I don't want to see. So when we were looking at master earlier, we saw all the extra bits and pieces that were associated with the project. For example, PDF file. I don't really need to see the PDF toolkit help system for this toolkit. If I was to open this up, it's binary anyway, so VSCode won't recognize it. I don't need to see it, so I'm going to hide that. Same with, you know, the to-do and anything else. It's not really relevant. You know, I don't need to know what's upcoming. Okay, if I want to see that, I'll go to the repository and take a look.
Yeah.
The other thing that's probably nice about this, depending on how you store your source files, is that you may want to do an exclusion for things like executables or MSI files, because when you're in a text editor, and you have your files in here, you don't want to inadvertently click on an executable. Okay. So I generally start off by configuring what I want to see within my IDE.
That makes sense.
Then what I like to do is set up my terminal. So I mentioned earlier, you can customize your terminals. If I bring up using Control-J, bring up the terminal down the bottom here, I've got the default PowerShell terminal. You can actually start to create your own. And the main reason I like to do this is I don't like to change, for anyone that's familiar with PowerShell, there's execution policies. I don't like to change the execution policy on my computer. I like to keep it always restricted. And that way my machine is just safe. I know that if I want to execute something, I have to change the execution policy for the scope that it's running in. So this is the nice thing about VS Code. I can open up my IDE and I can start a shell and I can label this anything I like. So, you know, at the moment I've just called it Devops, but I could call it PowerShell bypass, PowerShell remote signed, PowerShell restricted, and I know what context the shell is running in. It also saves you some typing. When you're starting to execute your scripts, you don't have to worry about setting the execution policy. All of these settings, we can provide a link later, but all of these settings are within the help system for Visual Studio Code. When you start to create your settings files, a lot of the times you'll notice that it actually embeds a link at the top. It creates these from templates. The help system within Visual Studio Code is amazing. So, you know, anything that I'm doing here, a lot of the settings are very, very vanilla. I don't alter them too much, but you go through the terminal section that we were just looking at, and we have a look at the profiles down here. Gives you some examples. Okay, just simple JSON. Okay, how to create a custom terminal, running PowerShell, and passing some arguments. Here we can see that they're actually running a script at the same time. So in my case, pretty simple. I'm just running really simple PowerShell script that is setting my execution policy. And basically what I want to do is bypass it, in this case, just so that it's ready for my build script. And I am also using OMI because I just like to customize the terminal just to give me a bit better of a visual. I know what branch I'm on. So, you know, if I am, you know, sort of switching to master, you'll see if I actually get it right. I can see my master branch. These guys will change. So watch what happens. Let me undo this change. Discard this change. And we'll go back here. And now I should be able to switch without any error message. And you can see here, master Devops. Obviously, this is command line Git, but like I said, it's fully integrated within VS Code. So if I want to switch branches using the GUI, I just come down here and I can see all the branches, and I can switch branches up here.
Nice.
Pretty simple. So some of the tweaks that I like to make, some more tweaks I like to make apart from your basic settings. Setting a default language for my project. That's kind of nice. VS Code's pretty good at detecting. It's a little, one thing that's a little annoying is that it won't detect and give you syntax highlighting until you save the file. So, and it doesn't, so obviously it figures it out via the extension. But if you set the default language, when you create a new file, it automatically starts to give you your code completion.
Nice.
Okay? So it's pretty nice. Without that, without the language detection, you won't get any of this stuff. And that's pretty much all I do for a basic settings file setup. There's so much more in there, though. I mean, you can set up linting if you're going that deep into your code standardization. PowerShell script analyzer will work really nicely with this. So you can set up rules around code, and it's all inline as well. So I don't have it in this demo, but you can actually set up your own customized PowerShell script analyzer so that, you know, things like you don't want people doing aliases. It'll actually pop up within the screen and warn the person that they can't use aliases. And you know, you can customize anything within there. So here's an example. I've just done an alias, all right, and now I'm hovering, and it's saying this is an alias of get child item, and we don't like aliases within our code. Quick fix, and it's changed the alias for me.
Goodness, this is way too cool.
Pretty nice. Yeah, it's pretty nice. And so you can access that. I'll give you a quick demo actually, because it is pretty nice. Standardizing code this way is definitely something people should be getting familiar with. I'm literally just now, I know my way around. For people that don't, okay, so you can go up here and go to preferences and settings, control comma. All right, and when you're starting to play with VS Code for the first time, don't forget, always look at the scope, okay? Because I don't want to save this in my personal settings file, which is stored in my app data. I want to save it in my workspace so that anybody else that's going to use this project will get the same settings. Okay. And there's a search up here if you want to search through and find things, you're not sure where to go. But in this case, I'm going to go down to extensions, PowerShell, and I'm just going to scroll down here. And down here somewhere, we will see PowerShell Script Analyzer. Here he is. Now, this is the default one that's built in. You can actually save this or one of these files in the root directory, okay? Or if you wanted to, you could just, you know, it's relative paths. So you could put it in the VS Code. You could go .vscode / and store it within the directory here if you want to keep things a little bit neater. But you could get a copy of this, and I normally just Google it because I always forget where it is, but you'll find it pretty quickly. There's a root repository somewhere. Just make sure you get the Microsoft one. Here it is. All right, and here is a default example. All right, so if we get a copy of this guy, and we come back over here, and we save this as our PowerShell script analyzer. Lost the file. Where did he go? Here he is. Save him in here. Now we've got our own copy of this that we can start to modify. So within here, you can see the default rules. Okay, I recommend you go off and have a read about this for linting. I won't go into it too much because there are so many rules here. But just as a really quick example, based on the one I just showed you regarding aliases, you can start to modify your rules. And you can see here, it's pretty easy to figure out. It's in plain text here. One of the default rules is PS, avoid using commandlet aliases. Now, if I was to delete that, save it, reload my project, and I type GCI again, it's not going to complain. It's going to allow me to use aliases. But really nice linting tool. Probably not the best linting tool I've used when I compare it to programming languages like Python or Ruby. There's a lot better linting tools out there for those. PowerShell is just one of those funny languages. It can be a little tricky because of the syntax around it, but it's still a really good tool to help you standardize your coding and your projects. Just makes it a little bit more professional. Code's a little bit tighter. So that's pretty much the main setup that I would use to customize my IDE. I mentioned that I had recommended extensions, and I'll show you how I did that. It's really cool. Built into VSCode, we've got extensions here. Massive amount of extensions out there in the community. I really try and keep it light. Like any sort of system, when you start to add extensions, it can start to slow you down. But two that I tend to use a lot, PowerShell, obviously. This is directly from Microsoft. Have a look at the extension community, go online and have a read about it to get familiar with it. But you'll see things like verified publishers. You obviously want to be careful with this stuff like anything. I tend to look at the verified publisher, the amount of downloads and stars typically, but I'm pretty familiar with most of them now. The really cool thing is, apart from installing and uninstalling, is under here, you can add to workspace recommendations so that you don't actually have to set up the project JSON file yourself. When you do that, what it does is, it creates a VS Code folder within your project if one doesn't exist, and it throws the extensions JSON file in there, which is really simple. And it has the extensions in there that are recommended. So if I was to open my project up and I don't have these extensions installed, it'll pop up and prompt me. And it lets the user say, yeah, install them, or ignore, don't bother me. Just another really nice way to sort of bundle your projects up in a way that other people in your teams can start to code quicker. There's so many extensions out there. The main ones, I use PowerShell, obviously. This one does all my syntax highlighting, inline code completion, and hints. There's a few other things in there as well, and there is also a preview version of this particular extension with the latest features. And TODO Tree is just a really simple one I came across. There's a lot of commenting extensions out there. TODO Tree is a really nice one purely because it gives you a graphical interface to templates. So I'll give you an example. This allows you to highlight comments depending on what characters you put in there, and then it'll actually throw it into a tree view. So what I've done, if you open up the toolkit, anyone that's used the toolkit will be familiar with this guy. This is the primary deployment application file for the toolkit. And what I've done is I've added a little to-do comment at each of the sections. So the core sections when you're building a deployment, variables, all the stages, pre-install, post-install. And because I've used this little to-do tree over here, throws it up in here. So I can just jump straight to the section within the PowerShell toolkit. Most people that have used this tool can pretty much jump there straight away. They know exactly what they're going to do with the certain types of MSI files they're going to use, you know, whether they want it to be silent or whether they want to have a repair task. But it's just a really cool extension, really lightweight. You can remove an item from the tree just by simply taking to do out of the section. But just a really nice little extension that I use a lot, not just with PowerShell, but I use it with a few other languages that I code in.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good thing to do if you want the same kind of, I need to go here and here and here and here, and then I'm completed, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, especially with a template system like DeployKit, because it is sectioned in such a way you are literally jumping from, you know, pre-install, install, post-install, done. You know? That's the core part of what I do for any setup. Depending on the language now, what I will do after that is set up build tasks. VSCode has this really cool task runner system. Again, it's all stored in JSON. I'll give you a quick look at it. Jump down to tasks here. Basically, tasks, you can point, depending on what language you're using, you can point it at any script, okay? Again, it uses relative paths, and there are some built-in variables within VS Code. Again, these are all documented within Microsoft's help system. But essentially, in this case, it's just saying my current working directory. There's quite a few other built-in variables that are useful. And all I'm saying in this case is I have a build task that is going to run the build PowerShell script within my VS Code directory. All right, that's the primary task, build. And then again, I have another task called Sandbox, which is going to run the Sandbox PowerShell script in the VS Code directory. Syntax is pretty much identical. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And then last of all, something nice that I like to do with the PowerShell toolkit is I have the app deploy toolkit help, which I am literally just invoking the toolkit help file. I don't know if some people may not even be aware that it's there, but I'll give you a quick demo. If I'm going to run a task within VS Code, Control-Shift-B brings up the task runner, and these are the 3 tasks that I have configured. You can actually, if you have a look at the syntax within the website, there's some advanced features where you can group and you can chain tasks together. You can also set tasks as a default so that Control-Shift-B will always run one specific task. And if you wanted to run other tasks, you would have to bring up the command palette to say run task and then choose which task you want to run. But in my case, I don't put default on. I just leave all of them as default so that I can select much quicker which one I want to run. So I'll give you an example. We're going to run the help in this case. I'm just going to close off some terminals here, and I'm going to run my app deploy toolkit task. And you can see down in the terminal, all it's doing is it's running the toolkit help, okay, which has come with the framework itself. So this is written by the developer, which will allow people to view all the functions that the framework provides when you want to run a deployment. And it's just going to load it up here. And here we go. And here's the help system. So anyone familiar with the code can just jump in and see what's going on. Saves you having to dot source it every time you want to run your project. You know, once people get familiar with these, most of the time they know what they're going to use. But it's just there's always an obscure one that you may not use very often that you need to jump in and take a look at.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And pretty easy. So a couple of the other ones in this case, I've got a build task, because I'm using this specifically for InTune, if we have a look at the build task, pretty simple. I've just got some global code here that I'm dot sourcing just to get some variables. I'm setting up my file system to create a cache directory so that I can start to build my deployment. And then I'm downloading the IntuneWIN app utility. If I don't already have it, just storing it on the file system, and then running the command itself using my current working directory to generate an InTune file. So if I run this guy and hit build, it's going to go away and execute the task. And it's grabbing my directory and it's thrown it out onto the desktop, and that's it. That's the IntuneWIN file for this particular project.
Wow.
Ready to be uploaded into the cloud. Now, obviously, this is empty, so it was pretty quick. This just comes down to processing power of your computer because of the way the IntuneWIN app utility works and creates the compressed file. So to take it a little bit further, this is a really basic example, but take it a little bit further, you can start to build in some DevOps actions so that we can look at maybe testing things before we put it into the cloud. You know, you don't want to build a 500 meg app, have to push it up into InTune only to realize you've made one little mistake. So, you know, in the old days, we would fire up a Hyper-V and we'd copy all our files over, or we'd mount a directory and we'd run our scripts. You can just start to automate the automations now. So I've created a second task here that's going to run a Sandbox on my computer, and it's going to inject the cache directory, and it's also going to run the application toolkit file. So it's going to execute this. It's going to do exactly what it would do once it's up in InTune. Now, obviously, this is the Microsoft Windows Sandbox system, which is cut down a little bit. So there are some limitations here. You may hit some problems with certain visual C++ redistributables and some other prerequisites, but most of the time it's pretty good. I'm not sure if everyone, if you're not familiar with it, I suggest you jump on Microsoft's TechNet and have a look at the Sandbox setup, because you can automate it just by simply creating an XML format style file. So I'll give you a demo of what it looks like when we run it. At the moment, there is nothing to install, so I'll run it, I'll show you what it looks like, and then we can do a really simple build. So here we go. It's creating its cache directory. It's firing up Sandbox. Again, just relying on our processing power here. And here's our Sandbox. And it's going to start to load the PowerShell application deployment toolkit script. And we'll get pretty much the same experience that the end user would get. Now, there's obviously some things to think about within the context of user rights, and in particular, the way InTune will run applications as system or user. So you would need to think about that within your testing framework. PowerShell application deployment toolkit has an XML file that you can edit to say whether or not admin rights are required for this particular installation. That will affect what you can see if you were to display prompts to the end user. But that's a little bit more on the advanced side. Anybody that knows anything about the toolkit will get what I mean. You need a little bit of understanding of the toolkit itself.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much it as far as the Sandbox goes. The Sandbox itself has to be injected with some extra tools if you are doing things like Winget using Package Manager, because it is such a cut down operating system. So that's just something else you would need to be mindful of. But literally the sandbox itself, if we were to pick apart, actually we'll go back there for a second and we'll have a look at the structure of it. Sandbox itself, all I'm doing within my task runner is caching a copy of these files into a temp directory on my local machine, and then using injecting the variables from my task into the XML file, so that when it runs within the sandbox, it's just literally pointing at a mounted directory on my host machine. So it's copied it over into program data on my machine into a cache directory, and here it is. And then we can see here, it's finally ready to rock and roll. Here's the PowerShell toolkit. And it's just going to continue and it's going to run. And here we go. We'll start to get the same prompts that the end user would get, because I haven't altered anything here and we're not running it in completely silent mode. And that's it. It's running away doing its thing. So that's obviously empty. There's nothing that it has to install there. So if we want to do a quick demo, we can set it up. I've actually got 7-zip here somewhere. Yep. So with PowerShell Toolkit, it relies on having a folder in the root directory called files. And you want to put your source files in there. If you do that, PowerShell Toolkit is kind of smart in that it has auto detection for MSI files. So probably I won't go through actually editing the core file now. It's probably something you might want to go through in another video if you are going to be doing more on PowerShell Toolkit, because it takes a little bit longer. But in this case, we can actually just run this vanilla script. We aren't editing anything about it. The framework's smart enough to know that there's a single MSI file in here and that we want to install it using standard, plain, vanilla MSI syntax. So if we were to run this sandbox again, all I've done is copy the MSI file into the project, and I'm going to run sandbox again. It's going to clean out my cache directory. It's going to set up a new one, mount it, and we in program data, and we're going to fire it up into Sandbox, and it should install 7-zip.
That's cool.
It's pretty cool. You can see how you can start to streamline things and really start to build deployments much, much faster. All right, here we go. Processing power of my Surface Pro.
Yeah.
So here we can see the cache directory. I throw it out on the desktop, but you can throw it anywhere you like within the sandbox itself. But here's the cache directory, and we can see this time it's got the files. It's injected 7-zip. And here we go. It's going to start to fire up the framework and get it ready. We're running it as an administrator in this case.
Yep.
Something else I like to do, just as an aside, for those people that are using this for InTune, is, and if you want to use the toolkit itself, the toolkit XML file, you want to look into the settings here. This is what I mentioned earlier about requiring admin or not requiring admin. If you were to install an application within the user context within InTune, you need to make sure that you're changing this here to false for it to run properly. The other thing that I like to do with this XML file is redirect the log files. So here I'm redirecting the log files for the toolkit to the InTune management extension folder. That way, when you do within the endpoint management console request diagnostics from the computer, you're getting all the logs back from any Win32 app deployment as well.
That's
So if we come
a
back,
clever tip.
yeah, it's really helpful. The default from the PowerShell toolkit is Windows log software.
Yeah.
Or software logs. So here we go. It's finally ready. And you can see it's smart enough. It's able to pull out the properties from the MSI file so it can even brand it. And it's ready to install. We haven't altered the PowerShell script, so this is completely visible to the user. When you get familiar with the framework, you can make things completely hidden. You can change deferrals. You can put in blocking applications so that it prompts the user to close Internet Explorer or Office before it runs it. In this case, we're just going to hit continue. PowerShell script's in the background. This particular part of the script would be hidden if it was running within InTune. Here we go. It's doing its thing. And installation is almost done. And we're almost there. There we go. We'll get a little prompt in just a second. And that's it. It's tested. 7-zips installed. We're ready to go.
Brilliant.
So obviously you can change so much stuff on here. In my live environment, so obviously this is just something I've done quickly for a demo. In my live environment, I actually export the scripts from this particular machine. So if we go over here and in the Sandbox, we fire up program data. Microsoft InTune management extension logs. So here's the log file. I actually, within my live environment, I grab these log files from the test sequence and pull them out for logging purposes, because you can actually check for exit codes. So something that you could think about if you wanted to, I haven't implemented it yet, but check for an exit code that's successful. And then once it's successful, actually go back and run the build script to create your InTune file, and then push that InTune file up into InTune itself.
So now suddenly you have a Unity tester here.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's pretty close.
Yeah.
I use Sandbox really because it's simple and it's quick, but it does have limitations. Long term, I think I'm probably going to look at moving this into Azure and having my unit test actually create a device in the cloud, fully built to our SOE, run the unit test there, and then push it into InTune. So for now, this meets my needs. It's quick and easy.
Yeah, this is really cool, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, apart from that, you know, there's not much else to it. There's some nice things you can do to speed up your code, your coding. There's a really cool system called Snippets. So Snippets, once you get used to the toolkit, you know, most of the time you're executing an MSI or executing an executable, you'll get familiar with the functions themselves, but it can be tedious to have to write them out. So what you can do is you could literally go into the deployment toolkit functions, grab every single function and create a snippet of it. So an example here would be we want to do an installation. So we're going to jump to the installation task. I'm going to fire up my command palette and I'm going to say snippet, insert snippet, and I've got 2 snippets saved. I'm going to say execute MSI, and that's it. It's literally grabbed the complete syntax for the PowerShell toolkit, thrown it in, and the nice thing about the variables setup is you can actually get it to position the cursor right where you want.
Wow, Then it's really
and
speeded
then,
up.
yeah, you know, you can get so quick. I've only put a couple here. In my live environment, I've got all of them. I've got every single function. And then I've got a few extra things that I do. So for instance, you know, something very common that people would do is they'd insert an MSI file. Let's say the MSI doesn't have any transforms. So it leaves a horrible shortcut on the desktop. And a lot of the times you'll insert a snippet, you'll remove a file, and yeah, done. Install, then remove the link afterwards.
And then Sandbox, and then
build. Sandbox it. And that's it. So you can see it's a pretty powerful tool. You know, it takes a little bit of practice, but you know, once you get your core stuff set up, obviously, you know, this has taken a little bit of time to set this up, but I've got this saved in my live environment as a repository. So, you know, most of the time what I'm doing now, I'm not doing any of that setup. All I'm doing is I'm just branching it. So, you know, in this case, I'll just say demo and I'll commit everything. So this is the integrated Git. I'm committing it, all those changes we just did, right? So I'm ready to create a new branch, right? So I'll come up here, branch, create a branch, Adobe Reader. Oh. I've got my vanilla repo ready to go. My code, my VS Code setup is ready to go. I've got my build task, I've got my extensions, I've got my snippets, I've got my task runner. All I need to do now is create a new folder called files, throw my Adobe files in there, go to deploy application or use my step finder, throw in my files, throw in my commands, and I'm pretty much ready to go. And that's sort of the nice thing about using Git, I think. I mean, it's not completely without its faults. I mean, as far as a templating system goes, but it's pretty good. You know, you start to get a really large branch set up, all your different apps. But the nice thing is, at any point in time, I can go back to my master, okay, or I'll go, in my case, it's Devops. I can make changes to my build script. So let's say with my build script, I no longer want to push it out to the desktop folder. I want to push it to the documents folder, right? Save that. That's my master template. Once I've saved that, I can then switch to my branch, and then using the standard Git commands, I can go to branch, merge branch, and pull it in, and all the changes will come across from the template itself. And obviously, you know, you have to look at your Git conflicts. You know, there's always going to be some in there potentially, but it's pretty smooth, pretty quick. And you can even automate that part as well, because obviously you wouldn't want to be going in and doing a merge on 100 different branches. You could create a build task that literally switches branch, like gets a list of all your branches, switches branch, merge from master, switch, merge, depending on how clean your code is.
That's awesome. It's a build factory, this one. Yeah,
it is. And, you know, it works for all languages. I mean, I was using this, originally I was using this with Chef.io, with building deployments with Ruby. Then I did some work with Python, and yeah, now Visual Studio with PowerShell. It's a pretty nice idea, I have to say.
Yeah, I'm impressed, very impressed. This was wow. Now you have templates for every common app that you need to deploy in your organization.
Yeah, and I think the automation that Microsoft are providing within the Azure infrastructure is really exciting, actually. I think there's a lot of opportunity to build even further. Like I say, have it automatically pushing up into InTune. I'm really looking forward to see what Microsoft do with Winget and the package manager. I think Winget is going to really help systems admins build evergreen packages that we don't have to continually maintain. I'm already using Winget within InTune at the moment with PowerShell Application Deployment Toolkit successfully. So, and they're apps that I'm probably not going to have to touch for a very long time now. So it would be nice to see what happens towards the end of the year. Hopefully we get some more information out of Microsoft with the deprecation of the Windows Store for Business to see what they're going to be doing there.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to wait for Ignite to maybe shed some light on that particular area.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. So this was a huge success, Chris. You made the whole story about how to get from 0 to hero in package automation, and that was pretty cool, using PowerShell App Deployment Toolkit as a template. That was
yeah,
massive.
There's a lot of stuff in there, a lot more stuff in there. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, reach out. Like I say, the help system's pretty amazing. Microsoft's done a really good job of putting examples up on their website. So check it out.
Chris, thank you so much for this. It's really helpful.
No problem. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. See you out there.